everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the first of this series of events organised by the Ada Lovelace Institute, which will be running every day this week under the heading Prototyping Ethics Futures. I'm Edward Harcourt. I am the Director of Research, Strategy and Innovation at the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and when I have time to spare, also a philosopher. The program's being recorded. We would love you to pose questions. See the Q&A function at the bottom of your control panel. The session is being recorded and will be available after it ends on the Ada Lovelace Institute website. The closed captions are also available by hitting the closed captions button at the bottom of your screen. And there is a link in the chat, which should appear imminently, for stream text if you prefer. So it's a pleasure to be here. Oh yes, and I should say, you're very welcome to engage in the conversation on Twitter at Ada Lovelace Institute and hashtag AI Ethics Futures. It's a pleasure to be here. I think everybody will be aware of how many pressing issues of an ethical and social nature are thrown up by AI and data science. And so the AHRC is pleased to have been funding what we see as some cutting edge work in this area through our partnership with the Ada Lovelace Institute and the Just AI Network. And you'll hear more about that today from one of our speakers, Allison Powell, a little bit later. Obviously, whatever kind of area you're doing research in, there are major challenges now because of the continuing COVID pandemic, but there are challenges that are peculiar to the AI ethics space. I guess one could pose this in a couple of different ways. One is in terms of skills. So in trying to think about the ethics of AI, many people simply on the basis of reading an article in the New Yorker or in Prospect can reel off a list of problem areas like transparency, responsibility, diversity, which bedevil the field. But how do you grow a community who can take the discussion of those issues to the next level, who can deepen our understanding of those issues and help us to make progress with them? That's not an easy task because we're often faced with disciplinary communities with disjoint skill sets. Some people who are expert in tech development, others who are expert in ethical and social science questions. And growing an genuinely interdisciplinary community where both sides of that skills divide can contribute in a symmetrical way and create a community which is no longer divided along those skills lines, I see as the major challenge of this field, and one which we as a research funder at AHRC are doing our best to solve. So without more ado, I'm going to introduce the first of our speakers, Dr. Alison Powell. Dr. Alison is a member of the Department of Media and Communications at the LSE, but she's currently the PI on the Just AI Network, which is a co-fund between the Ada Lovelace Institute and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And her specialization has been in the various different manifestations of the way in which our values interact with the design of technology. So Alison, over to you.
Thank you so much, Edward. It's really a pleasure to be here. And today I'm going to take the opportunity of this amazing kind of meeting of the minds in this session to share a little bit of about how the Just AI Network has approached these really challenging features that Edward has just outlined. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And so what we've been doing over the last 14 months has been exploring capacity building on data and AI from a humanities-led perspective. And today I'm going to be talking about the network's work, and this presentation was produced by the team at LSE that has been working most closely on this, myself, Louise Hickman, and Emre Bard. And as you know, we're spending the whole week working through and investigating some of the different aspects of our practice over this year. And we're also trying to use this week's events as a way of building out our community and helping more people to understand how to engage with these pressing questions that we have. So what we've been doing in our work is exploring how to think about networking from the perspective of, an ethics of care. And I really want to thank both the AHRC and the Ada Lovelace Institute for the support of this project, which has been prototyping new ways of building capacity by using different metaphorical and philosophical ideas about networking to do so. And of course, as with everyone who's been working over this past year, we've been confronted with a massive shift, not only in what we expected to do in this project, but in fact, our resources, both our emotional resources, but also our kind of shift towards using technological resources to do this work of networking. So what was expected to be a year featuring a series of in-person workshops co-located with major conferences across the technical, social, and creative fields of data and AI has become a multidisciplinary process of experimentation, iteration, and reflection on the idea of a network and the ways that humanities-led work can build capacity on issues of extreme social significance, like data and AI. And I want to highlight and appreciate the entire team that's been working on this. This is a team that has a huge amount of diversity, and it's also a team that has a huge and wide-ranging humanities-based expertise. From the core team, myself, Louise, and Imre, who have backgrounds in English, American Studies and Communication, and Philosophy, respectively, to Octavia Reeve, who has been our core partner within the Ada Lovelace Institute, who has a background in cultural studies, our research assistants, Paulina Garcel Corral and Imogen Fairbairn, who are here at the LSE in methodology and media and communications, and our visiting postdoctoral researcher, Paula Crutchlow, who has been a practicing artist for 20 years and is now a PhD in geography. So this team was lucky enough, about 6 months into the project, to have the addition of the Just AI Fellows, who have also been supported by the AHRC to pursue primarily creative and research-led investigations of racial justice in relation to data and AI ethics issues. And so they bring their own really wide-ranging interests in different kinds of approaches to data and AI ethics. Yasmin Boudiaf is a creative technologist. Irene Fubara-Manuel is working at the University of Sussex in media practice. Sarah Chander comes from policy, and Squirrel Nation, which are Erinma Ochu and Caroline Ward, have backgrounds respectively in neuroscience and art research. So we really want to highlight that this project has benefited from this diversity as well as from this deep engagement with the humanities. So today I'm going to talk through some of the different ways that we've been thinking about these problems that Edward sketched out, particularly from the perspective of networks and networking. And as we know from joining things like LinkedIn, networking has become instrumentalized. So in our project, we try to use a wider range of metaphors and understandings of networking to open out different potential approaches, using not only social scientific practices of network analysis, but also notions of networks in relation to trees, ecologies, and relational engagements, like the ones that I talk about in some of my previous work, this provides us with metaphors that are more dynamic and can help to create these different sorts of opportunities for capacity building. We also think of times and spaces as being really important in building capacity, and particularly in generating these dynamic and potentially very controversial and contested conversations around the key questions of data and AI ethics. Our project has been a short one, but we have also been reflecting on the different times and spaces of the recent past, the emergent future, and the emergent present, and the speculative future. Finally, our work has engaged really strongly with the concept of a prototype, or the process of prototyping. We can imagine a prototype as an object or practice that connects ideas, skills, expertise, and critical reflections. A prototype can also be a translation concept, because prototyping is a common practice in technical fields where an idea first becomes functional as proof of concept through a prototype. So prototypes are moments in a longer span of innovation and create and depend on feedback loops that are responsive to critical engagement. So perhaps prototyping might be an ethics in practice. Prototyping might be a way of thinking of this generous exchange of skills that may be required for the future of data and AI ethics research. So we had a series of research questions as we began our research. We wanted to know, what was this data and AI ethics research? Who conducted it? How could people find out about it? And more importantly, how could people who were working in this area find out about what other people were doing in order to create these kinds of conversations that would be required to advance the field and address some of the more pressing issues? Finally, we really wanted to figure out how we could think about creating ways to create inclusive dynamics and foreground marginal voices and emergent practices to prevent a further siloing of the ways that the work in this field gets done. So we began with what we call the recent past, using methods of literature mapping and network analysis to identify who had been publishing on what, where, with whom, and how they were describing it. This proved to be quite challenging, because an enormous number of papers has been published recently on AI and data ethics, and this number has been increasing substantially over the past decade. So what we decided to do was look at this entire decade and try to think about what had been published and how we could represent the relationships between the publications and the people who were writing them. So Emery Bard led a process of literature mapping using large databases of publications, the Web of Science, ACM, Archive, SSRN, the IEEE, and SpringerLink, and did some bibliometric analysis based on search terms related to data science, big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, autonomous systems, and automated decisions in relation to ethics, virtues, morals, or data ethics. What we produced were a number of different visualizations, both of people, places, and ideas. I don't have time today to talk to you specifically about all of the wonderful things that we managed to find through the analysis of all of this data, but I will say that our data is available openly on GitHub at justainet.github.io/mapping. In this particular visualization, we show where authors of papers are from. This is what's called an institutional collaboration network. It's drawn from a global data set. What it shows is something that perhaps shouldn't surprise us. The UK is a very prominent contributor to this field of data and AI ethics research. We can see here that some well-known and well-funded universities are central to this network. But what it also shows is that there's a range of other institutions that have many different collaborators internationally. People are working with Canadian, American, Australian universities, as well as universities across Europe. Importantly, we also see that there are many different connections between different types of universities, large public universities, but also technical universities and places where different kinds of skills are likely to be developed. So I think it's very interesting to look at both, not just who is writing, but also if we have the ability to look in greater detail, what kind of thing people are writing about. This is a much more detailed network visualization, which is based on the keywords that are included in the abstracts of some papers. Here we've created two different clusters of mapping concepts of justice within the broad set of articles written about data and AI ethics, which is on the right-hand side, and data justice, which is this smaller fan-shaped network of clustering on the left-hand side. Here, we have both authors and their papers. So this visualization allows us to see which people have been writing together on these issues and whether there are any particular papers that are strongly connected into these networks on looking at justice on the one hand, within a kind of more general discussion, and data justice more specifically. But what's really interesting to me, and particularly from this broader perspective that Edward has set out for us, is who connects these different conversations about justice as a philosophical concept and data justice as an operational research practice that often connects specific user groups, such as local authorities, with people who are writing on data issues. So there are a few published papers that are cited in both of these groups. One of them is written by Joe Bates. Another one is written by Lynette Taylor. Lynette and Joe, if you're watching, well done. You have illustrated that there are ways that we can connect different kinds of conversations on these topics through our published writing, but also through different means of creating conversations. What this image makes me think is, what if we invited Lynette and Joe and a number of people from those two different clusters to have a conversation about their work, their connections, the disputes, the different possibilities that might arise if they began to speak with each other. Which brings us to the next phase of our work, in the emerging present. Here, we've been investigating a lab model from a humanities perspective as a way of capacity building around data and AI ethics. This work has been led by Louise Hickman, who is extremely experienced in creating these kinds of process-led spaces for interdisciplinary discussions over time, which I think in this pandemic year have provided an alternative to conferences that's very powerful. In our project, we've experimented with these kinds of lab spaces in 4 different ways. The fellows have hosted a lab on racial justice, which has been sustained by the advisory group for the fellowship program, who is a group of more senior and experienced scholars also working on racial justice issues. They meet regularly, they have broad conversations. We also have struck 3 working groups that allow us to develop collaborations with our co-travelers in different universities and research settings, from the private sector in technology development through the Ethics in Practice working group to organizations who are interested in access, as well as scholars working on rights, access, and refusal, and data and environment. And of course, you have seen already that the rest of this week focuses on the topics that have been the topics and discussions that have been generated within these spaces. So we've made relationships through these explorations of lab-based work, both by building our fellowship program in a way that involves many people who have been working on racial justice issues, as well as people who can advise on other aspects of the work. We've also been building collaborations through our other working groups and through the reflections in our lab-based model. I want to just highlight specifically regionally that we've been really strongly connected to the west of England and the southwest since we were inspired by the Southwest Creative Technology Network's fellowship program when we put together our fellowship program. And Teresa Dillon, who was involved with that, is also working with us on one of our working groups. We've given talks in many different places. And what I really wanted to illustrate with this graphic is that our ideas and relationships in the kind of space that we've created in this emerging present is likely to grow over time in ways that we can't anticipate. We're just so grateful to everyone who has started to have these interesting conversations with us, has hosted us for talks, or has come to any of our open labs, our near future AI fiction workshops, or indeed to this week. So finally, we arrive, as always, at the speculative future, where we think about how prototypes, these kinds of attempts to provide a proof of concept for a particular idea, might create opportunities for reflection and connection. So here we decided to use some features of technical development in a way to allow us to speculate on how we could grow these conversations over time and into the future. So our questions here were, how could we build and support this kind of network that we'd already put into practice with an online tool, how we could develop new conversations and new modes of engagement, and whether or not we could use online platforms to perform a kind of networking with care. So what we decided to do was to build a functioning technical prototype that would allow people to see how they had come to the field of data and AI ethics. Partly, this was a response to thinking about what we learned through our mapping. When we were doing literature mapping, we could only work with what was already published. That meant that all of the conversations that were happening now couldn't really be represented in that data set. We could see whose work might have connected in the past based on citations, but we couldn't see what might make a difference in the future. And given that all of the issues that we're talking about are so pressing and significant, we really wanted to think about whether we could do this in some way. So we decided to produce a prototype that would draw on a kind of reflective survey, on a sort of survey tool that would ask a participant to think about what motivated them to start working in this area, how they defined their own work, how they thought about their relationships with other people, whether there were people or ideas that were really significant and generative for them. Also, we wanted to know who was working in this field, how long they had been working, and what different kinds of backgrounds people had. We thought this might be a really interesting way to generate conversations between people with similar interests and different backgrounds. We have just about finished this prototype, and today I'm really excited to walk you through how it works. And then later on this week, we will invite you to join and to join the our community of testers, so that and help us to finalize its design. So when you finish our survey, which asks you all of these interesting questions about where you have what kind of work you've done, you visit this page, this web page. This shows you a fingerprint which is a visualization of your answers to our questions about how and in which way you've been working on data and AI ethics. We wanted this visualization to be provocative and visually interesting. So we decided to use this kind of branching schema to show different ways that people's work can be represented in different areas. So here I'm mousing over whether this person thinks of themselves as an AI, as an ethicist, what area of education they've been working in, and lower down how their answers connect with the entire community that's been working on data and AI ethics. This is a very, very dense visualization. We think it's really going to be very interesting to work through in workshop settings as an alternative to doing in-person paper-based workshops. Each of these circles is a particular question, and each of the bars is an answer to the question. So if you mouse over the circles, you can see where your response is and how your response compares to others. This really provides an opening for discussions. So for example, in this response, this person was not identifying themselves as an ethicist, nor were their colleagues identifying them as an ethicist. However, you can see the comparison between this person's response and all of the other responses on the survey. This helps to kind of generate conversations about difference. How is my perspective different than your perspective? These are some of the critical skills that the humanities brings to questions around data and AI ethics. And these sorts of tools, we think, are ways for those conversations to progress. So for example, the person who has responded to this survey has a background in computer science, but other responses have backgrounds in engineering and technology, in history, or in media. All of the different question arrays can be visited. You can turn the labels on so you can interpret where the questions came from, or you can turn the labels off and appreciate the kind of aesthetic invitation to discussion. When you look more specifically at this individual fingerprint, this also gives a kind of biography in an image. So for example, this fingerprint has different color densities for different kinds of outputs, whether those are policy reports, academic writing, convenings, or workshops. It shows whether people have been recently arrived in this field or have a very long experience. Many people who have been working in this area for a long time may not define themselves as ethicists, but may have other related interests and educational backgrounds that are relevant. So just to sum up on our prototype, what we wanted to generate here is a kind of like conversation about connectedness, about how our own biographies show our different kinds of skills and perspectives, and how these biographies might also show, in comparison and contrast, places where people might wish to collaborate or exchange on their own identity in terms of this work that they're doing, or the kinds of themes that they enjoy working on. As I said, we are launching this prototype this week. Please make sure you're signed up to our mailing list or visit the Ada Lovelace webpage later in the week, where we'll be launching a button where you can go straight through to join this prototype. Also, make sure that you follow on Twitter, and we will be announcing when we go live. I'm coming to the end of my few moments of talking about how we've engaged with these kinds of questions around interdisciplinarity, data, and AI ethics. And so I just want to close by re-inviting all of you to the rest of this week's events. Unfortunately, we have had to reschedule our Networking with Care in-person workshop, where we will be working through the paper versions of these prototypes to Wednesday, when it will be sunny. That workshop and the data walk will both meet at the LSE campus in central London. If you're able to join us there, that would be lovely. Otherwise, there's an enormous range of other discussions occurring across the week online. There is also another offsite event in Exeter on Wednesday afternoon if you're down in the southwest of England. And finally, big thanks to everyone who has traveled with us, and also to everyone who is here who will be a fellow traveler with us. Our website is just-ai.net. That will push you through to the Ada Lovelace website where all of our content is hosted. We've been blogging consistently about all the different bits and pieces of our project. We are also on Twitter, and please do keep up with us as we continue this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alison. You've given us a great deal to think about there. So let me now introduce our second speaker, Hetan Shah. Hetan is Chief Executive of the British Academy and also Deputy Chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute. Hetan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Edward and Alison. Thanks very much for putting this event together. Delighted to be here. So many of you will know the British Academy. We are the National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And what I wanted to do today was, in a sense, speak at a kind of higher level. Alison's been showing us kind of how networking kind of at the ground might be thought about and reflected on from the perspective of capacity building. I wanted to come in at the level of policy and consider how is the policy environment at the moment for the kinds of initiatives that we're discussing here today, and you know, where are the opportunities, what are the threats, and so on. And I think when thinking about the opportunities, the first thing perhaps to say is today the Prime Minister has announced that he will be chairing a new Ministerial Council for Science and Technology. So this is obviously very much the kind of thing that pertains to the work of Just AI and the Ada Lovelace Institute. That new Ministerial Council will be supported by a unit in the Cabinet Office, and Sir Patrick Vallance, whom all of you know as the Government Chief Scientific Advisor in the UK, has also now taken on a new National Technology Advisor role. And the government has also recommitted to increasing research and development expenditure to the 2.4% OECD average target, I think by 2027. So that all, I think, is a kind of series of opportunities for the kind of agenda that we're discussing here today. More generally, this might be framed by the integrated review of security and international policy, where again, science and research were very central in the kind of government's ambition to become more globally minded. And I think also post-pandemic, we're not quite post-pandemic, post some of the perhaps worst of the pandemic, I have noticed, I think, something of a change in the way that the government and research operate together. I think there was more porousness within the policymaking community towards research. I think we're post the kind of had enough of experts phase of the kind of conversation now. And I think that there's much more interest in data sharing, which happened in particular at speed during the kind of worst moments of the pandemic. And there's an important question, I think, as to how far we can retain some of the best of what happened there into future phases. Having laid out, I suppose, some opportunities there in the policy environment, there are also a series of threats. I mean, the first obvious one is that a lot of the conversation is happening in the language of science and technology. And the question, I think, is when is science broadly defined to include social science and humanities, and when is it narrowly defined? And there's no single answer to that. I think it does depend upon the context. And for example, it was noteworthy to us that Sir Patrick Vallance asked the British Academy to do a report as the National Academy on the societal impacts of the pandemic. So, you know, he very much saw us as a conduit and our disciplines as a conduit to casting light, and very much within his remit as Government Chief Scientific Advisor. Will this new council see its remit in the same way? When you consider bodies like SAGE, for example, out of the 80 or so people who have been listed on its membership, there's only one person from the humanities community. So I think there's a question of our disciplines being fully represented, which does need thinking about. There's also, I think, a pipeline issue and wider noises coming out, for example, from certain bits of the policy community, in particular the Department for Education, around the value of arts, humanities and social sciences, some language around dead-end courses and so on, which I think is pretty unhelpful. I think that does need thinking about, and I suspect will have a long-term consequence on take up and pipeline of humanities scholars. And then a third issue, I think, which needs thinking about with the creation of this new structure today, or announcement of new structure today, is the balance between what one might call a strategic approach within government and the room for bottom-up led discovery and blue skies research. And it remains to be seen whether today's announcement will change that balance at all. My hope is that it will not, that the government is going to retain commitment to that discovery research, which is very, very important, because, you know, had you gone back 10 years ago and tried to be strategic and say, what should research be focused on, would you have picked a pandemic? You know, it's all very easy to be strategic after the fact, but it's very important to invest across a wide range of portfolios when the future is uncertain. So let me just now touch on a few ways forward, given the landscape that I've outlined. The first is recognizing that as the discourse towards subjects has perhaps narrowed in a way that may not always be helpful to the humanities and social sciences, we need to take control of the narrative a bit more. And STEM has been a very successful way of describing the sciences, and we at the British Academy, working with others, have developed the notion of SHAPE, social science, humanities and arts for people and the economy, as an alternative way of talking about ourselves as the subjects which deal with culture, humanity, people, behaviour, society. That is now, I think, starting to be picked up in a variety of places, although the term STEM took a decade before it was sort of widely in use, and it may well be that SHAPE is the same, but that we hope is a helpful intervention in just describing the role of our subjects and the way that SHAPE and STEM work best together. The second thing I think I'd point to is the importance of a diverse funding landscape. So having talked about the worries that you might find if everything becomes strategic and dictated from certain kinds of government priorities. And so, you know, I talk in this context about the role of a body like the British Academy, which gives out a lot of discovery research funding, allowing, you know, cutting edge researchers to fund themselves, to set their own priorities and, you know, go where the research takes them. And just, you know, a variety of examples of things that we're funding at the moment, including a new Oxford Handbook of the Philosophy of AI, refugee-led social protection and the impact of digital technologies, or work on data labeling and gender. And those are just a few of the projects that we're supporting. And I think that we work really well in partnership with our counterparts at the AHRC, and the different kinds of funding pots that we have really, I think, complement one another. The third thing I'd point to is the importance of supporting early career researchers who I think have been massively impacted by the pandemic, but even before that were, I think, in an increasingly competitive space and sometimes a precarious space in terms of their research funding. And again, I think national academies have got a role to play here. The British Academy has just launched a new early career research network, which is funded by the Wolfson Foundation. We're piloting that in the Midlands in the coming year. We really want to bring early career researchers together to support one another, but also to be able to convene them and bring them in touch with businesses and policymakers in their regions. And that convening function, I think, is also worth saying a bit more about, not only at the level of early career researchers, but also, for example, the British Academy's role in bringing people together around policy questions. So work we're doing with the UCL at the moment on AI and the future of work. We're bringing together business, trade unions, researchers, policymakers, and so on. So that convening and networking, capacity building at multiple levels is very, very important. And then let me end on a final reflection, which is that much of the work that happens, I think, around science and technology, and in particular in academia, tends to be incremental in nature. But I think one of the powers of the humanities and the arts is a space for social imagination and the chance to actually reconceptualize in a more radical way than perhaps is on the table an alternate vision or future. And so, although most research isn't going to be like that, we need to keep a slice of our time and space for more radical, perhaps utopian visions which paint alternative futures, and those themselves can then go on to change the way that technologies operate and ethics operate. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hetan. That's great. So I'll now introduce our third speaker, Professor Gina Neff. Gina, thank you very much for joining us. Gina is Professor of Technology and Society at the Oxford Internet Institute and a member of the Department of Sociology at Oxford University. Her speciality is the effects of the adoption of AI across a wide variety of different contexts. Gina, over to you.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure I can be heard. Yes, good. First, I want to thank Dr. Powell and the Just AI team for this extraordinary amount of work that we are celebrating today and this week. And in light of that, also the AHRC for supporting this, and Ada Lovelace for helping to foster and build this network. I want to make 2 points in my comments, and I think they dovetail quite nicely into Hetan's comments as well. The first that this work shows that we're talking about today really is that AI can no longer be thought of as a domain of science and technology. We have to stop thinking about AI as science and technology. What this project, the Just AI Network, has done is help make these problems around a new technology sensible and making sense-making across multiple kinds of disciplines and multiple kinds of communities. They've moved from theorizing and thinking about the philosophical or ethical implications, how should we think about AI, into what should we do? What should the practices be? And in creating a tool that helps us visualize the communities of practice around this incredible problem that is occurring, this incredible and urgent problem that is occurring around how to build fair, safe, effective, and just artificial intelligence systems. The Just AI Network has really brought into focus this notion of the different kinds of disciplines that are involved and necessary and needed. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, first, the work that we've been doing at the Oxford Internet Institute has along with a group called the Women's Forum for Economy and Society, has done a series of focus groups with Fortune 500 leaders around what they think about AI ethics. And not surprisingly, surveys that we've done show that business leaders know AI ethics is a serious problem they should be thinking about. So when we bring them into focus groups and say, what are you doing? No one can give us a clear answer. So it's one thing when the largest technology companies have devoted teams of thinking about ethical AI. We can argue the debates of these. But move one step down into the companies that are doing our financial systems, our legal systems, our social infrastructure, in our retail systems that are working in mortgage lending, that are working in providing professional services, that are working in creating the future of work. One step down from those companies, and they're at a loss for what to do in practice. And so the kinds of work that the Just AI Network has taken on this year really helps us see how we might close this urgent implementation gap. Now, this brings me to my second point. Why is this problem so urgent? What is urgent now? I would put forward to you that when we're talking about AI, I would love to be talking only about a set of statistical tools for helping to parse large data sets. As the co-author of a forthcoming book on human-centered data science, I can tell you that the kinds of ways we talk about fairness and ethics and justice in the social science and humanities is quite different from how those same concepts get talked about by our colleagues in data science and machine learning. So my second point is for those of us who are concerned about, not about advancing the statistical models, but are concerned about how power works in society, how people's daily lives are affected and impacted. We need to be thinking about AI and artificial intelligence, machine learning technologies as inequality engines. Inequality engines in a post-pandemic, unjust society and societies. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, the work that Just AI has done is because they have expressly articulated the work around AI ethics in a framework of data justice and in a framework of the racial justice conversations that we've been having over the past 12 months. They've allowed us to connect some dots, that the decisions being made about the infrastructures being built right now are happening in certain kinds of conversations that many communities are not invited into. What the Just AI Network has done is try to begin to think about a way that you could start to have these community participation in really complex technologies to help bring more people into the urgency of the problems that we're facing. So, two things. We can no longer talk about AI and machine learning technologies as just being the purview of science and technology. Right? They're becoming pervasive in many more societal realms. There are many more kinds of leaders, many more kinds of community leaders, business leaders, many more kinds of disciplines where the decisions are being made that impact many lives. And so we have to start thinking about how do we bring our sense making into those kinds of conversations from multiple kinds of conversations. And then the second is that we can no longer think about these technologies as simply neutral or ways of parsing data, that they become part and parcel of building infrastructures that lead into kinds of inequalities and amplify, with the potential to amplify those inequalities. And so what can be done? Well, I want to give a nod to the initiative that the British Academy put forward of thinking about shape. So thinking about how do we have a set of disciplines that understands that we can no longer separate science and technology disciplines away from arts, humanities, and the social sciences. How can we start to think integratively about the kinds of knowledges we need to bring to not just this problem, but to many of society's biggest problems? That is one. Two, how are we going to train up people who do the work? And by that, I mean, where are we building the community capacity, be it from a trade union capacity, be it from professional organization capacity, be it from business leader capacity, be it from community activist capacity? Where and who is going to be involved in ensuring that we can expand the number of people able to enter into these networks and make powerful interventions from their own perspective, their own situated knowledges, their own abilities to move and motivate within their communities. So with that, I want to again thank Allison and her team for the amazing work that they've done this year. I know certainly I was watching the conversation go by, and many people very excited about this visualization tool. Many people very excited to help make sense of their own work in AI ethics here on this call. And my call to us would be to think, who else can we be inviting into these conversations, and how can we be expanding the work that must be done urgently? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gina, and to all our speakers. That was great. So we've got about half an hour left. A number of questions are appearing in the chat. There are so many questions that I'd like to ask myself. So there's a question from Tricia Griffin. She asks, and this is a question for Allison, do the questions incorporate the ideas and histories of decolonial ethicists? What might a decolonial AI approach look like in the context of your networks?
That's a wonderful question, Tricia. Thank you for asking that. The visualization tool, as you can see from my walkthrough, presents in its kind of branching and color-coded manner only a certain number of questions that we ask in this survey. And the other questions that we ask in the survey are actually really about what Gina has pointed to, which is this larger conversation that needs to happen around how ethics is understood and indeed practiced in different communities. So the survey tool asks, for example, how you identify your own work, whether you're paid for it, whether it's something that you are, whether you're working on something that you that is in line with what you worked on in the past, or whether you've changed your perspective. It asks you to describe what the keywords are that you think are important. Because when we were doing the literature mapping, we realized that we were, of course, limited to the kinds of keywords in the articles that were already published. And in particular, in order to do these kinds of large-scale data visualizations, we were really constrained by the infrastructure of access to those publications. So when we did the first round, we only drew from Web of Science, partly because their data is better structured. We couldn't get us access to as many humanities publications, not even talking about decolonial ethicists and or Black computing or any of these other areas where these discussions are unfolding, because many of those publications are not in journal articles, they are in books. And so already when we were doing our literature mapping, we could see that there were different kinds of gaps emerging. So we were trying to think of different ways to address those gaps. And in part, the Racial Justice Fellowship and the lab-based work that we've been doing around racial justice and foregrounding these divergent ideas has actually allowed us to work quite a lot on the concept of decolonial ethics. I'm going to give a shout out to Mustafa Ali, who's based at the Open University, because Mustafa has made a huge contribution to Just AI, particularly in this area, both through supporting the Racial Justice Fellows, but also by contributing to another project that we undertook, which was the commissioning of science fiction writing on particular areas of data and AI ethics that we worked through in a series of public salons. That publication that comes out of that commissioning, which is 2 new short stories and a brand new essay from Adam Merrick, Tanya Hirschman, and Irinosan Okajie, is going to be out with Meat Space Press in the autumn. And it includes the community's commentary from the salons. So that whole thing is a dialogue about what AI ethics might look like in the near future. And of course, this huge debate about what that ethics is to begin with. So I guess the short answer is, it's really hard to represent all of these divergent perspectives on a single plane. And only by kind of shifting your perspective to be able to see them, you actually get to some of the major ethical issues that we're contended with. So thanks you so much for the question.
Thanks very much, Alison. So the next question is from Graham Bukowski. I won't read the whole thing, but he says, what does the panel think are the key issues associated with AI and data ethics that need exploring with the public? In short, what are the urgent opportunities for public engagement and AI and data ethics? So I'm going to, Hetan, would you like to contribute to that first?
Yeah, thanks so much. And there's so much in a way. I mean, the AI territory, as we know, it's a general purpose technology, and so actually cuts across everything. And so I think it makes public deliberation quite tricky. I mean, there's a mix, I think, of what you might say are kind of nearer term deployment questions and then sort of longer term ones. And they're not just about AI. So for example, I think we mustn't always skip over the data bit, because there are data things which are non-AI things. I'll give you an example. Wastewater testing for the pandemic raises a bunch of data ethics questions on both sides. You know, I mean, often people sort of think ethics is about saying no, but it's often not that. I mean, sometimes ethics demands that you act, but it's about kind of thinking through conceptually those sorts of questions. So that's a near-term one. You know, longer-term ones might be self-driving cars, or you know, all sorts of things. But the issue, I think, is with public deliberation, it's quite hard to have these conversations at a very high level of abstraction. So I think it's a mixture of focusing in on a specific question or a specific area and saying, what does this mean? And then occasionally having some wider, I mean, the Ada Lovelace Institute has been doing some brilliant work looking at biometric technology and the public perception of that. But I think that is very hard to think about at that level of abstraction. So it's quite important to sort of drill down and say, what does that mean in this particular area? And it's worth just finally saying, you know, it is really important for this public deliberation to be a kind of balancing of the scale of the commercial interests which often drive technology. And it's not to say commercial interests are bad, it's just to say that they have a set of interests and views. And in particular, when thinking about the regulatory space, public perceptions and views have really got really important in driving where we prioritize that.
Great, thank you very much. Alison, did you want to comment on that?
So I would say that from the perspective that we've developed, I agree with Hetan that this is really challenging because AI could be absolutely everywhere. And so I would actually take the question in a different way. And I would say that what we need to be really attentive to is who is in the room when discussing that specific application. And really looking at specific applications also allows you to get to that diversity of knowledge, and also allows you to ask those really significant justice-based questions. So just to give an example of one of the things that we've been thinking about through the year, and this is a topic that also hasn't really disappeared, the concept of vulnerability is actually one that is now defined in data and is processed through different kinds of AI systems. So being defined as a vulnerable person during the pandemic meant that you could have access to different kinds of services. But vulnerability itself became a kind of a definition that was constructed from commercial data and then filtered through a kind of policy lens. Vulnerability, whether or not you could book a grocery delivery slot, for example, became something a major kind of, you know, ethical, something to ethically contend with. So for, you know, if we take this example, taking the perspective of nothing about us without us, you can focus on any of those kinds of specific issues where, you know, you're no longer talking about AI as a sort of general all-purpose scary something that's doing everything, but you're starting to look at what's happening with the provision of social services in my local area. How are we going to manage data about service provision, you know, or your access to food, or indeed, you know, the quality of the water and the presence or absence of COVID in the water.
Thank you very much. I'm going to return to the chatted the Q&A in a second, but I want to pick up on something that Hetan just said and ask Gina a question. So Gina, you said towards the end of your remarks, how can we think integratively about AI and data science and ethics? And how can we build capacity so that people involved in the discussion have both the requisite skill sets? And I quite agree with you that that's an absolutely fundamental challenge. But my question to you is, when we're dealing with the public sector, I mean, public providers are supposed to be just in their distribution of goods. That's their duty. But the private sector have got no particular duty to be to worry about inequalities. They don't have to, you know, they just sell to the people who have the power to buy. How do you incentivize the people who are at the cutting edge of technology to think in that integrative way? So you said technologies amplify inequality. How do you bring ethics onto the radar of people who are developing new technologies in such a way that these infrastructures don't simply go on amplifying inequalities?
That's a great question. And I have to preface my answer by saying, first, I am no lawyer, but we have in place regulatory frameworks and structures that allow for making sure companies don't deceive the public. And yet, we know that there's a kind of AI snake oil happening at the moment. We say, you know, government provision of services, yes, absolutely, very important. But as Allison just pointed out, there are enormous and deep ties and links of how governments around the world purchase technology services and data from private companies. Decisions that we often don't have access to, that often are not transparent to public scrutiny. Fortunately, the UK is one of the global leaders in helping to train and think about how do we do the provision of AI for the public sector. There's wonderful work that's been happening. That's one of the reasons why we see a lot of activity and excitement happening in this country. Really can be a leader for how we go forward in thinking about AI for the public good. But what does that mean? What are the levers that we have to work with private sector organizations? And I think there's a few. The first is around their customers, whether we are talking about companies that sell and vend to other companies or whether we have end users. We have to be really clear and transparent about what is being bought and what is being sold. In a report we did last year, I did with Maggie McGrath and Nayana Prakash, we talked about the kind of AI failures that we see in news accounts around the world. And one thing that's really apparent from many news stories that are at the cutting edge of how we're talking about in the press about AI is that many companies are selling goods and services as AI, but then when you lift the hood, what you see is either outsourced engineering that's happening in another part of the world, outsourced human labor that's happening in long global supply chains of work, far from sets of accountabilities, or you're seeing something that is just gussied up and sold. So we have to have some accountability and responsibility when it comes to this. Second, you know, the work that we've done in the implementation gap of AI, we actually see one sector that's incredibly thoughtful about how they're making decisions around automated decision making in their supply chain business flow. And that's financial services. Why? Because financial services are hugely regulated in most Western countries, and they have to be able to explain their decisions. So having in place a set of regulatory practices has led to a set of organizational practices, company and firm decisions of how things will work through workflows that really constrain perhaps the runaway speed with which the technology can develop, but at the same time allows them to know they have fail-safes in place to make sure that they're making just and fair decisions. And so I think that there's models out there. You know, we don't have to reinvent from scratch. there are models out there for how industries have put in place smarter ways to think about responsible technology adoption. What we know is they're not going to do it simply by relying on their data science teams. So their data science and data engineering teams are not going to be the only place that these policies has to absolutely come through in terms of thinking very clearly with the communities where they work, thinking about their stakeholders very broadly defined, thinking about the unintended uses and abuses of their technologies and tools when they go out and are released, and then thinking about how they're going to be responsive to problems when they do arise. Are they going to be able to deliver fair and just decisions when they have a problem, or are they going to try to sweep it under the rug?
Fantastic, thank you. I'm sure there's I know there's a lot more to be said on that, but let's return to the Q&A. So here's a question from Gabrielle Berman, and I guess this is going back to an earlier strand of discussion, Alison, about how do you use your work on networks to get from what is to what ought to be? So the question is, how do you move from focusing on English language publications and networks towards thinking more globally into a broader network and critiquing high income, frequently Western versions of ethics? And what are the implications of that for justice?
Again, an excellent question. I had a peek in the Q&A, and I really want to thank everyone for their generosity and curiosity as well. This question about language, power, and money is a really central one for these kinds of conceptions of justice, and also for these kind of provocative and difficult conversations I think we have to come. Our mapping, as I said, was very limited because not only were we limited to English language sources because these are the best indexed, we were also by our funders tasked with looking at networking and kind of network and capacity building for the UK in relation to these kinds of topics, which meant that our not all of our mapping looks at global data. Some of the mapping, including the first slide that I showed in my talk today, does look at global mapping in terms of co-authorship networks. You do see universities that are outside the global north in that mapping. You do not see them as central or dominant. This is, of course, not a surprise because we understand how power and influence and particularly money move. So you can actually use the data that we've collected to create visualizations and look at their edges. This is in fact what we did when we were first looking to see which kinds of topics we might want to strike working groups around. The working group on rights and access and responsibility was also driven by this question around vulnerability that emerged through the pandemic. But the other two are based on analysis of the networks and places where things get a little thin, or these kinds of connections between nodes are represented only by a few people. So you can actually look at the data and look not at what is central and instead at what is marginal or poorly connected. And I think that does provide an opportunity to sort of shift conversations and introduce new and different perspectives. As I said before, we really were limited in looking at kind of, the extensive literature on decolonial AI and racial justice issues in AI, but we also identified that that was missing from our data set, and that was part of the reason that we advocated for some support for these fellowships specifically focused on racial justice. So I guess network methods are often very interested in where things are dense and well connected, but I think they can also be valuable for looking at where things are less connected. And just the last thing on that point is that one thing we really wanted to do and were not able to do because we didn't have enough human capacity or time was actually look at where money came from for these different kinds of research institutes that were central in the network. And I think this is a really wonderful project, which I'm hoping to do as soon as I have time, to look not only at where Research Council funding has gone. We were very happy, thank you, AHRC, for providing the public data on grants given in the area of data and AI ethics. We were able to map that. Thank you to any university colleagues whose departments actually did respond to my request for who funded your data and AI ethics research. But there's a lot more to do in that area, and that will also provide another layer of discussion and perhaps another opportunity to see how you can redress some of those injustices.
Thanks very much. That's great. So the next question is from Helen Pallett, and she asks, she says, the EPSRC is mostly framing its AI ethics related funding in the language of responsible innovation. Is this compatible with the humanities focus on justice? Now, as somebody who's spent quite a lot of time talking to the EPSRC about this, my answer to that question is yes, it is. Because, I mean, first of all, I don't think either the subject of responsible innovation or the subject of justice is the preserve of any particular discipline or set of disciplines. They're just universal concerns of all human beings. And I think it's the road to ruin to think that because a question is an ethical question, it needs to be hived off and dealt with in a kind of humanities only space. So one of the things that AHRC is trying to do in its collaborations with the Ada Lovelace Institute is to foster interdisciplinarity and an integrated capacity so that the data scientists and the ethicists can deal with this stuff together rather than dealing with it in separate bubbles. But Alison, maybe that's not your answer. Maybe I've got it all wrong. Tell me.
No, I just wanted to build on that, and I wanted to identify that the theme of ethics in practice has been something really significant for us, and that has come out of that identification, Edward, that these things are always ethical issues. It's just that they are not always described as such. And I can see in the chat and in the Q&A, there's a lot of questions about how do you deal with the fact that some people get to define what's an ethical question, and some people then have their actual moral responses to things classified as not really ethical because the ethics are happening over there. This is a huge issue. And I think our focus has really been trying to think about ethics as a practice, and about our project as enacting a set of practices that can potentially create different spaces for other people to reflect on their ethics as practice. And so our working group on ethics and practice builds on some of my previous work on technology designers and their actual work, their day-to-day work. That was the Virtue Project. We looked at startups making Internet of Things technologies. And we spent a lot of time just hanging around, running workshops with people who worked in small companies, trying to figure out where were the moments where an ethical, like what we might, ethical hat wearing people might say is an ethical conversation, and other people think of as part of their job. So identifying those locations is something that the Ethics in Practice Working Group is still thinking about. They have an absolutely amazing panel from across industry and the Ada Lovelace Institute on Friday. So if this is something you're interested in, please make sure you attend that one as well.
Thank you. Gina, did you want to come in on this question?
I am a little bit of an optimist on this question. So, change has to come in two directions. First, we've seen a real sea change about how we're talking about responsible technology within the technology, engineering, science sector. So for example, there is a large investment, multi-research council investment on trusted autonomous systems. They've just invited me to chair the scientific committee on that, this international scientific committee that will help them think through how are they framing what is in first a program of research around making better trusted autonomous technologies that we might actually want to think about how these intersect with society. So as a social scientist, I see some courage, in that. The second is, NeurIPS, the large AI conference, has just put together for this round of submissions ethical review. And this will be a set of reviews on, not every paper, but on a set of reviews where papers will go through that ethics process in a way to ask some serious questions and to ensure that people are raising and reflecting on. And that's we want to see that happening, not as an ethicist for hire, so to speak, brought onto research teams, that we actually see this kind of ethics in practice happening, and social considerations happening in practice. But I think we also need to remember that fundamental social science and humanities research still needs to happen, and research about how these infrastructures and how these technologies are becoming everyday infrastructures absolutely needs to ask different kinds of questions, not just how do we build better technologies, but should we even be building these technologies?
Thank you very much. And I think this is such an important question, really. I'm going to say another couple of brief things. I mean, just to underscore the importance of what Alison said a minute ago, that quite a lot, as I understand it, of what the Just AI Network is trying to do is a sort of consciousness raising, because what is ethics is not necessarily what carries the label ethics. There's a great deal of stuff that affects human lives for good or ill, in other words, is ethics, that bears some quite other label. And we won't be able to think in an integrated way about how to take things forward until we can see beyond those labels. The other thing I wanted to say was about the notion of humanities-led investigation. So you might say, well, look, the three of us have, and Hetan, when he was still with us, are banging on about the need for integrating the tech and the ethics. In other words, breaking down silos between humanities and the sciences. So what's humanities-led here? And I think we need to distinguish, and Alison, again, correct me if I'm misrepresenting you, but between the content of what we're saying and the methodology. So what really excites, well, there are many things that excite me about the Just AI Network, but one of the things that was particularly sort of very obviously humanities-led in your presentation this morning, Alison, was the methodology. So it's this diagramming, it's the design-led approach, it's the consultative approach, it's the prototyping. These are methods that are characteristic of designers, not methods that are necessarily characteristic of the hard scientists, of the hard sciences. But where you're trying to lead us with that humanities-led approach is not in the direction of a humanities silo, but rather in the direction of an integrated way of thinking. Is that a fair representation of what you're up to?
That's extremely elegant and very astutely observed, Edward. Thank you for sort of noticing actually the practice is the methodological practice also, and to be thinking very carefully about how metaphors carry ethical or philosophical values within them, and that is a fundamentally humanities-led assumption to begin with. But what has been joyful and really delightful about this project is that because we're taking a design-led approach, and because there are fun things to look at and interesting conversations to be had, it really does help with this kind of consciousness raising and discussion. And we've also tried to create multiple ways in. So we also we've had the chance to speak to so many of our colleagues across the country who are interested in different aspects of this work. So we have shown intensive versions of the network work to the Birkbeck Data Science Initiative, and also to the TAS partners at York, who are running the Trusted Autonomous Systems Hub, and who are a combination of computer scientists, data scientists, and philosophers. And so these are different to provide them with a way in, using methods that are a little bit more familiar to them, to bring them into a conversation that they can then see that there's something else going on through this kind of lab structure or through the other sorts of discussions, is also a really nice way of, methodological generosity, let's say.
Thank you. So I've got 4 questions outstanding and we've got 9 minutes left. So that's a signal to Alison and Gina to, well, the clock is ticking, but I'm going to try and get through them all. So this one I think I'm going to throw to Gina. How well do you think the UK government is prepared to lead the conversation on innovation and ethics in AI? For example, as compared to the draft regulation for guidelines on AI produced by the EU? Or do you think the government is only only has a role as a source of financial support?
That's a great question. And, you know, I'm not sure I have a really ready answer, except to say we have an enormous and phenomenal amount of capacity here in the UK, and I think we can do something positive about it. So we have sets of conversations that are already happening, sets of conduits that happen between the AI ethics community and the larger technology communities in London. I think we need to talk very seriously about how we bring more cities and regions into that conversation. And I think we need to talk about how we bring more and different kinds of communities into that conversation. So the current excitement about AI in the UK from policy angles has been seen as an engine of growth and innovation in a post-Brexit landscape. And I think we can build on that by helping to bring more people into that conversation.
Thank you. And then the remaining questions I'm going to try and pose as one to Alison without, I hope, emptying them of all their specificity. So part of the question is, how do the concerns of AI ethics translate into political geographies outside of the North Atlantic, California, and Western Europe? What was distinctive in your research? Have you discovered to be distinctive about AI ethics in research from other locations? Then another question with a similar but not a geographical spin on the question of who's being left out of the discussion. Can you tell me how your research informs the debate about identifying who is excluded from the academic discussions, on what basis, and how is this connected to the intersectional manner in which individuals experience exclusion? And then finally, are you able to use your approach to identify existing and emerging schools of thought, dominant mental models and thought leaders, and linkages and gaps between them? So all in a way around the issue of who's not driving the discussion, who's on the margins of the discussion. How does your methodology help us to identify those and bring them more towards the center of the discussion?
Thank you to all the people who asked those questions. So the last question is the easiest to answer, because the answer to that is yes, actually. You know, these kinds of methods, interpretive methods, like the kinds of literature mapping we did, do help to identify emergent strands, or what I like to think of as lines of flight. And I like to think about lines of flight because these are, you know, these methods are not a map. Like, this is not a formula. You do some network analysis and then you know everything. We really are using these as a tool for reflection that we can use alongside our other tools for reflection, which include reading and, you know, and thinking through tricky problems, employing critical analysis, and employing concepts, for example, such as intersectionality, to what we are encountering. So if you apply the concept of intersectionality to the kinds of questions that are raised by network maps, you can start saying, wait a second, you know, it's very easy to see centrality here. We can actually look up who is in these places and who is writing on these things. And let's look at these things that are disconnected. And let's do an analysis that's based on a notion of intersectional inequality. And then we can ask a question about where and how might that voice be connected to some other voice, and where could we potentially, you know, create a different kind of dynamic that could be more inclusive. On the question about different geographies and indeed different epistemologies, I have much more to say about this. It is in my other work, So please, have a look. I have a book out recently that called Undoing Optimization that actually looks at different epistemological approaches to questions of, in this case, optimization through smart cities. In this work, we were not able to explicitly center non-dominant epistemologies. And that is in part because of the methods that we had at hand when we began. And this is a really wonderful project to take forward in this area. What are the other things and the other places where these kinds of questions are discussed? I'll just do one quick shout out to Jason Lewis at Concordia University in Canada and his research team that has been thinking about AI from a North American Indigenous perspective. From a non-Western philosophical perspective, what does AI look like? Is it a friend? Is it one of your relatives? In a philosophy where non-human and non-living entities are also in relation to you, what do we make of these other kinds of non-human relational entities? I just want to leave that as a provocative question for everyone, because it's one that we did not talk about in this particular round of reflection, and one perhaps that is actually very important for the way that we're going to go forward and think.
Good, thank you very much. Thanks so much to our three panelists, Alison, Gina, and Hetan. Thank you to all of you who sent in questions, and apologies to any questions which we didn't get the opportunity to air. Just in closing, please continue the conversation on Twitter at Ada Lovelace Institute. And I'd like to remind you that there are more events taking place every day this week on prototyping ethics futures. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock BST, Professor Teresa Dillon will chair a panel on data, AI, and the environment. And for full details of the series of events, have a look at the Ada Lovelace website. That's adalovelace.org. Meanwhile, I look forward to continuing the series, continuing to listen in on the series myself. Thanks all very much for joining us.